Thank you so much for joining me today and welcome to today's teaching. We're going to carry on from what I did last week, because I've really felt that it's so important that we have a confidence in God, that we are confident that He knows our every need. There's not one thing that can happen to us where God is not aware of it. Sometimes we sob alone. And it says that He actually keeps a record of this, and He keeps all our tears in His wineskin. So we are never alone. And God is aware of every single thing that we go through. And I believe that He wants us to have a faith and a confidence in Him that all of our needs are going to be met, and that He is aware if there's ever any kind of deprivation or any problem at all that we are facing. So last week, I looked at a particular scripture in Ezekiel 26 and then in 29. And I want to pick it up there. And just for those of you who didn't listen to last week's, I encourage you to do so. But I'm just going to see the particular scripture that we looked at. And in Ezekiel chapter 26, Ezekiel prophesied to the city of Tyre, which was a coastal city, and part of the city was on the coast, on the mainland, and the other was on an island. And he prophesied to them, because when Israel was taken off into captivity, and then Judah was taken off into captivity, it was because God was exercising judgment on them. However, he really took offense at the fact that the city of Tyre had rejoiced in what had befallen the people of God, and they were gloating over it, and they were going, oh, now they've fallen, we're going to be prosperous. And so God exercised judgment on them as well. And he got Ezekiel to prophesy to them and say to them, I'm going to send Nebuchadnezzar, the King of Kings, he called him, though we know, of course, Jesus Christ is the King of Kings. But he said, this great King of the kings of the earth, I'm going to send him, and he's going to build siege works against your walls, and he's going to break in, and he's really going to devastate your city. And so that was part of the prophecy. And he actually explained how it was going to be scraped as bare as a rock. But this siege actually lasted for 13 years. And that is probably one of the longest sieges you can imagine. And the reason for this was because it was on the coast, and because the island city was out at some distance in the water of the waters of the ocean. They didn't run out of food as soon as other cities would have run out, because some of it was because it was accessible by boat. And so they would be able to send the boat for provisions, and they would bring it in. And so this siege lasted a really, really long time, 13 years. Sorry if that made a noise. I bumped the mic in my gesticulation. But anyway, so they came back. They would bring the food in, and that was what caused the people to be able to withstand the siege for so long. But eventually they ran out. And Nebuchadnezzar and his armies went in, and sure enough, it was conquered. But then the amazing thing is that in Ezekiel 29, God prophesies, and he says to Ezekiel, I actually want to read this, even though I read it last time, just to remind us. He said this. This is in Ezekiel 29, reading from verse 17. God is always accurate. He'll always tell us when something happens, and when something's going to happen. And it says from verse 17, in the 27th year, in the first month, on the first day, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, drove his army in a hard campaign against Tyre. Every head was rubbed bare, and every shoulder made raw. And that was because they had to carry these heavy stones in baskets on their shoulders and stones on their heads. And so from continually building up these siege ramps, it had an effect on their physical bodies. And so their shoulders were raw from carrying all these things, and all the hair had been rubbed off their head. God even noticed that. It says this, yet... I just love this. This is the second part of verse 18. It says, yet he and his army got no reward from the campaign. from the campaign he led against Tyre. So God noticed, he said they got no reward. There was no plunder because the soldiers used to be paid by the plunder that they got from the cities that they were able to overpower. But because it had gone on for so long, all the treasures had been taken out by boats somewhere else, and there was actually nothing that they could have as a reward. So, and God noticed that. He said they got no reward. He says, therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am going to give Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he will carry off its wealth. He will loot and plunder the land as pay for his army. I have given him Egypt as a reward for his efforts, because he and his army did it for me, declares the sovereign Lord. And there's just so much that we can glean from this. God noticed that they weren't rewarded. God knew that this was something that he had done. He had required Nebuchadnezzar to go and actually besiege the city of Tyre and eventually defeat it. And God goes, you know what, they got no reward and they were doing this for me. And this is something that I really and truly need us to understand, is that God takes it personally when we have a need. God takes it personally when look, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't even a child of God. He was a heathen king, but God had raised him up, and God said, in doing this, Nebuchadnezzar was working for me. And how much more when we are God's children? Will God take it personally if we are without, if we, like in COVID, during COVID-19 and the lockdowns, so many people lost their employment, or they lost income that just didn't come in. Like I think I've got a couple of friends who are hairdressers, and they weren't able to cut hair and earn a living while the lockdown happened on the first stages, stage 5 and 4. They weren't able to earn a living. I've got friends who own restaurants. We've got a church that's linked to Open Skies, which is my church. And it's one in Maritzburg, and they are in a center, a beautiful new shopping center that was built. And it had just been built, and people had come in. There were restaurants and shops there. And one particular restaurant, the couple who opened it, had put all their life savings. I think it was 1.5 million rand. They'd put it into building up this restaurant, and then suddenly they shut it down. And it just really is horrible to know that they lost everything. However, this has happened to many, many, many people. But there is no way that God will let us go unrewarded, because we weren't working because we weren't able to work. And when I say we, I'm just identifying with people who owned restaurants, were hairdressers, who went to work and were employed, and maybe the people that employed them have had to shut down their businesses because they were out of action for 5 months. But everybody worldwide is in a similar situation. But as Christians, we need to look at these two things that I've read to you, not just in Matthew, but I've read this in Ezekiel, to know that God was the best, excuse my dog, that God was the best employer that there was. And he said, I can't let these people work for me for nothing. And so I'm going to give them Egypt as a reward. And so after this campaign where they broke in to the city of Tyre, found that there was no plunder, he then directed them to Egypt, which was also under judgment. And there were treasures, there was plunder, and they were able to carry that off as 13 years worth of back pay. And this is just amazing to me, because sometimes, and if we could just believe this, sometimes God doesn't give us our reward when we feel we should get it. Sometimes you tithe and give and you think, oh goodness, I have a need and it's not being met. And I'm going to give you a testimony of something that happened to me where I actually really experienced this. But God will give you your reward when it's of most benefit to you. He won't give it to you at a time when you will just fritter it away, because these guys who had worked in Nebuchadnezzar's army There were always prostitutes who went along and they found their way to where soldiers were. And if they had got their money incrementally, which means in increments, so it might be every month, it might be every year, it might be every season. But if those soldiers had been given their pay incrementally, what would have happened? What could have happened? They could have wasted their money on prostitutes. Remember, they'd been away from home a really long time and they were not people of God. So immorality was something that was rife. They could have gambled it away. Soldiers love to gamble. Well, lots of people love to gamble. But just in order, in a siege, to occupy their time, to make it more exciting for them. They could have had it stolen from them. Loads of things could have happened to that money, and it wouldn't have been of any benefit. But instead, they just worked and they got the food that they had to eat. They got their needs met during that time. However, they didn't get the reward. They didn't get their pay for having besieged Tyre. And Nebuchadnezzar certainly wouldn't have given their money. However, God did, because God said they weren't working for Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was working for me. And when you work for God, God will ensure that every need of yours is met, and he will never allow you to do anything for him without ensuring that you get some kind of reward. And so, when they had plundered Egypt, they went home. It would have been 14 years since they left home. And they got 14 years worth of back pay in one go. Well, 13 years worth of back pay. And then the back pay for Egypt they got at the time that they would normally get it. So they went back to Babylon after 14 years away, carrying all this plunder. 13 years back pay plus the current reward for attacking Egypt. So when they got back home to their own land, their families who hadn't seen them in this lengthy time would have received all this money. There would have been money for the farm, there would have been money for their businesses, there would have been money for anything that they needed it for, which is actually remarkable. And I want to just give you a testimony of something that happened to me. I've always been somebody who's tithed and given, always. And I've had needs met, and God has done wonderful things for me. But I knew, well, I didn't know. I guess I never even thought about it. But I think that I had probably given lots that I hadn't seen a reward in direct proportion to what I'd given. Not that I ever thought about that. Because I don't want to be like the person I spoke about a couple of weeks ago in Psalm 17, verse 14. It talks about men of this world whose reward is in this life. I don't want to have all my rewards in this life. I much prefer them to have gone ahead of me, because your heart is where your treasure lies, and my treasure lies in heaven. So I would rather be rewarded there than here. However, I definitely know that there were rewards that God had kept stored up for me. And that's dear little Pollyanna, barking her head off. But anyway, I knew that there were rewards that were due to me, but it didn't even occur to me. I thought maybe I'll get it in heaven. However, I had bought the first house that I'd owned since I'd been a Christian. I'd bought it, and it was an old house that somebody had started to build for cash to add an extension, but in the meantime something had happened and he'd stopped. So I'd bought the house incredibly inexpensively. It's in Cowie's Hill, which is an area that is an expensive area to live in. And yet I had bought this 3-bedroomed house with an extension and a swimming pool and half an acre of land for 193,000 rand. And this was in 1998. And at that time, that could barely buy you a 1-bedroom flat. So I'd bought it for that, and then had to borrow 100,000 rand from the bank. So all in all, it was 300,000. And eventually sold it when I moved to the place I'm in now for 1.5 million. So just getting that house, which needed to be completed, was part of the reward. But I looked around the house and I realized that I really didn't have things. They had built a kitchen with a big alcove for a big double door fridge, and I didn't have anything like that. I'd been living in a place that had a built-in stove. I didn't have a stove. And there were so many things I didn't have. And I was thinking, okay, I'll make do. Where there's this alcove, I'll put in a pot plant. Where there's this, I'll do such and such, because it was no problem whatsoever. But on the day that I was due to move in, I'd come in the morning and was looking as the few things I had were unpacked. I heard singing out in the streets. And the house was below the road. And I looked up and there was a furniture van that was parked there. And it was a Hirsch's van, and that's one of our better furniture places. And they began to carry in furniture. They brought in a big double-door fridge, which they put in the alcove. They brought in a dishwasher, which I'd never had, a washing machine, a tumble dryer, an oven, and a hob. They brought in absolutely everything I could possibly need electrically and put it in place. Somebody had taken me shopping and said, I really want you to buy the kind of couches you would like. Somebody else bought me a beautiful bed. And I can only say that I just stood there and I was completely and utterly blown away. I just wanted to weep with gratitude. And I love to tell this testimony because it's something that I will never forget. Just the way in which every last thing was done. I had never had new curtains. New curtains were put throughout my house. There were many things that I had never had that were given to me at that time. And I knew that all of these, although God used people, I knew all of these were God giving me the rewards that had been stored up for me. And I thought about it afterwards, and I thought, if God had given things to me incrementally, I know what I would have done. I'm not going to tell you. But anyway, I know what I would have done. And it really wouldn't have benefited me. And so I want to encourage you, because God is not a respecter of persons. Whatever God did for Nebuchadnezzar, he did for me. Because he was essentially saying to me, Fiona, I know that a lot of what you've done for me, and you haven't had any kind of compensation for it. But don't worry, I've had it all stored up, and this is your current harvest. And it was just poured out. And I've seen God do things like this for me and for others. And I really want to encourage you. God has absolutely no favorites. We are all his children. And just the other day, I was listening to somebody or watching somebody on TBN, I believe. And he's a minister by the name of Leon Fontaine. Not Des Fontaine, Leon Fontaine, and he's Canadian. And I just got the very end of what it was that he was preaching on. But I loved the end I got. And he said, my wife and I have 5 children. And he said, when we sit down to a meal, if we're going to sit down to a lovely steak meal, I don't take 4 of my children and put them here and give them steak and tell one to sit over there and I'll give him a hot dog. He said, if it's steak for one, it's steak for all. He said, when we take them shopping for new clothes, he said, I don't take 3 of them. I think he said 4, but I'm going to say 3. Don't take 3 of them here and buy them really nice clothes. And for my wife and I, and over there's some that I just go, no, you're just going to get hand-me-downs. And that really struck my heart, because sometimes we think that's just for you. It's okay, Fiona, it's in the Bible, but I can believe that for other people, and I believe it happened for you, but I can't believe it's going to happen for me. But you know what? This is where you have to believe it. You don't really have any other option, because God is your Father, and he says he's no respecter of persons, and so what he's done for one, he can do for you. God bless you. And I pray that your faith is stirred and that you are encouraged to ask anything, whatever, remember from a few weeks back, and knowing that God knows your every need. And so bless you, and I'll talk to you next week.